Okay. First off, Professor Peterson, I'm not critiquing how you acted during the first half of the interview in order to offer any sort of pointers or gotchas. I'm doing it to set up my explanation for why you ended up devastating Cathy Newman. In the previous part, I described how Cathy has been using her threat narrative framing to dominate her interview, more like an inquisition. Cathy Newman's strategy is to emphasize the potential danger of men and exaggerate the vulnerability of women. In particular, she's been attempting to dominate your identity in the eyes of the audience by making you out to be somehow harmful to women. In response, you've appeared understandably defensive. Your body language is subdued, your gaze averted. The last point I noticed quite a bit. You rarely look directly at Cathy Newman as you're responding to her. Cathy dominated the debate frame in the beginning. What I mean by that is she successfully framed the debate in terms of women's vulnerabilities. When you're arguing with someone who's trying to establish a threat narrative of female victimhood and male culpability, you should avoid arguing with them over whether or not women are victims of something or anything. You always want to be arguing a point that even if you lose that specific point, they don't actually win anything in terms of the threat narrative they're trying to spin. It just sort of ends in a draw. For example, you don't want to argue the wage gap. You want to be arguing the spending gap. The fact that women control more spending than men. The spending gap is devastating and simple. There have been many groups of people throughout history who have controlled more resources than they have created. People who control more resources than they create are not oppressed by definition. Ultimately, if you're wrong about the spending gap, then people who don't have more power than men, then women don't have more power than men. But if you're wrong about the wage gap, then women have less power than men. This combats one of the framing tricks used to protect a threat narrative. When Cathy centers the argument on women's vulnerability, in this case the wage gap, she doesn't have to prove it. She just has to create enough uncertainty about the facts that people will err on the side of caution. The side of caution here is believing that women are victims of the wage gap. It's really, really unfair, but it's how people work intellectually and emotionally. So when you switch the debate from her wage gap frame to the spending gap, specifically you switched it to the fact that women control the marketplace. That's when everything changed. And I mean everything. Most people are going to be encountering this in the emotional dimension because that's how most people navigate their world. Emotions are just shortcuts that we've developed based on patterns and knowledge that we trust. Without emotions, we can't make a decision. So what they're going to be looking for is body language, tone of voice, and reactions. So watch. Watch as you describe how women dominate the marketplace and that she's wrong that men do. You're suddenly assertive, and it's an assertiveness that's edging into anger. The I will brook no dissent tone of voice, the physical gesture, first time in this interview in which you are pointing directly at Cathy. You're pointing at her. And add to that, you are looking directly at her. Anger is an honest emotion. I think that's why we're often afraid of men's anger. It's honest and it's forthright. And now that we've seen you show it, everyone engaging this on an emotional level will look back at your previous behavior and say, oh, he wasn't defensive before, he was holding back. Now let's look at what you're saying, because this is the reason why I think I gave that long explanation of why when you argue with the threat narrative, when you argue the threat narrative of women's oppression by men, you should avoid arguing women's vulnerability and instead argue women's power. You've picked up, in this one moment, you've picked up a men's rights talking point about women's power in society, and you're using it to reframe this debate. Look at Cathy's response. She looks and sounds like a spanked child. It's because you've blown her threat narrative out of the water. You've maneuvered her into a frame in which, even if she creates uncertainty, you don't lose. You've put her on the defensive, trying to answer for women's greater spending power. You're now winning, not just in the rational dimension where you've always been winning because Cathy's just looked like an asshat, but the emotional dimension. And you're putting up a good damn fight in the threat narrative dimension. All with a men's rights talking point. And you don't stop there. You go on to tell Cathy Young that she is making you uncomfortable during the interview, and you even challenge her by saying, why should you have the right to do that? People in the rational dimension will look at this particular statement you've made, and they'll see the ethical and logical contradictions she's making. And the ethical and logical contradictions she exists within. She's a journalist. She needs to have the right to offend to even do what she does. But your response, but what you said exists in more than just the rational dimension. You're turning her language around on her. Once again, you're putting her on the defensive. Not just answering for women's greater power, but answering for her greater power in the interview. What gives you the right? That language is the language of controlling someone's identity. What you've done is say you have the right to judge her morally, judge her identity by referencing your vulnerability. That's why she's flummoxed. She's not even blinking in shock or looking like a spanked child. She's just stopped working. She's like, blah, 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 blah. Remember, in the threat narrative dimension, the way you establish dominance is by exaggerating your vulnerability. In this case, you don't exaggerate anything. You are just being honest. And by inflating your target's potential harm to you. Again, you are just being honest about her making you uncomfortable. But the end result is that you neutralized her threat narrative. You have now won in every dimension, rational, emotional, and dominance. You said in interviews about this inquisition by Cathy Young that this was the moment you felt you were talking with an actual human being. It's because in neutralizing her threat narrative, you forced her to start operating in the emotional and rational dimensions again. You cut the weight off and she bobbed back up to the surface, and she saw you for the first time as a human being, not a servant that needed to be taught his place. When I put out one of my most downvoted videos in this channel's history, this is exactly what I was talking about. The video is called Professor Peterson, The Problem Isn't Cultural Marxism. In it, I describe the situation of our society as Penelope gone mad and tearing apart her weaving because she sees Odysseus not as her lost love returned to her, but as a threat. When I say Penelope is tearing apart her weaving, I mean women like Cathy Newman are tearing apart the basis of our society. They're tearing apart the emotional and rational aspects of language in order to turn it into a tool of dominance through threat narratives. And I'll talk about this more at a later date because I've got a lot to say on the topic. Deprogramming women, everyone, yes, I'm getting to it. In that video, I said the only way to stop the Cathy Newmans of the world in their madness is for Odysseus to lift up a mirror and show Penelope what she's doing to him. That mirror is his experience of her actions, his vulnerability to her actions, to say, you're making me uncomfortable. That's what you did. You lifted up the mirror, used your vulnerabilities to reflect her actions back at her, to make her take adult responsibility for your vulnerabilities as a man. And for a moment, Cathy Newman was made whole. This is what I've been saying all along. As difficult as men's issues and men's vulnerabilities are for men to look at, much less internalize, they are the tools that will cleanse the world of the threat narrative people like Cathy Newman are using to dominate. I know that men's issues and men's vulnerabilities are the most difficult things to talk about in our society. Men don't want to feel weak or small or incapable or useless, and I don't want to make them feel that way. But look at the reality. When you said men aren't that powerful and you're hurting me, paraphrased, to Cathy Newman, you weren't saying those things from a position of weakness or inability or smallness or uselessness. Unlike a lot of what you said throughout the first part of the interview, some of it said defensively, some conversationally, some conciliatorily, unlike all of that, you said both of those statements with power and authority. And Cathy Newman responded to that power, your power, by being petulantly submissive and momentarily silenced by her own sudden insight. And the reason why you said both statements with power was because they gave you power to go toe-to-toe with Cathy Newman's attempt to control your identity. That's what I want for young men. I try to give young men these weapons, the shield of men's issues, the sword of their own vulnerabilities. And I guess sometimes they only see them in terms of how they've been hurt by them. But you've just demonstrated to all your young male followers how men's issues and their own vulnerabilities as men are both shield and sword against the Cathy Newmans of the world who try to dominate men's identities through threat narratives. I'm aware of how difficult it is for men to pick up the sword and shield because they seem like the exact opposite of what they need or want. Because dominance in the threat narrative dimension is the opposite of how men assert dominance. And young men want to feel powerful, that's lacking in their lives, and capable. And men's issues don't give them that. They want to feel useful, and their own vulnerabilities certainly are not an expression of usefulness. Feminist theory gives them that stinging, drug-bright feeling of power and invulnerability. It's actually seductive to young men, like a siren's song. But if young men can get past the discomfort of wielding men's issues as a shield and their vulnerabilities as a sword, if they can learn from it and internalize exactly what you did, they can fight back against that seduction and fight back against being dominated by the Cathy Newmans of their world. Just like you. I also know that men are worried that if they embrace this sword and shield and use it, somehow they're going to stop wanting to help, wanting to serve, wanting to grow up, wanting to be a good mate to a woman. No. Cathy Newman's threat narrative was never responsible for young men wanting to be useful. Women's control over men's identities never made them serve, only changed who they served. Namely Cathy Newman and whatever ideological interests she represents. The desire to protect and provide is instinct. Give me 100,000 years to apply alternative evolutionary pressures or the ability to genetically modify men, and I might be able to get rid of men's desire to sacrifice for the benefit of women in society, or engage in pro-social competition, or respond to women's vulnerabilities. That's not going anywhere because it's innate to you. And that's the greatest, ugliest threat narrative trick of them all. Men are led to believe that the things they most cherish about themselves are actually forced out of them by threat narratives. So they identify with the narrative when they should identify with themselves. Have you ever thought about the implications that your lectures on growing up attract far, 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 far more men than women? Not because men need to grow up more, but because young men are more attracted to the message of growing up. Young men are more attracted to the message of sacrifice to others, of service to others, of strength in order to help others. When you say that your lectures on growing up attract more young men, and you also add that women seem to be attracted to your message that men have to grow up to be good mates for them, not the message that young women need to grow the fuck up, I have to say that makes me wonder about young women and their priorities, or their absolute lack thereof. And then I look at Cathy Newman, and I can't believe that a woman in her 40s would make a face like this. And I'm going to insert the image where she looks like a petulant child. And then I'm going to use the image, or the video where Jordan Peterson says no one likes an overgrown infant. Because she fucking looks like an Anyway. The only time she looked and acted like she had any kind of adult identity was after you blew her threat narrative out of the water and forced her into a position of facing adult responsibility for your rights and vulnerabilities as a man. You might argue that cultural Marxism is the proximal cause of all this, but it isn't. Marxist analysis of minorities issues just buttress the central threat narrative, which is men oppressing women. This kind of threat narrative dominance only happens when one group of people exerts power over another's identities through displays of their own vulnerability. Look at Cathy's response here, and I'm going to insert the part where she stumbles. She starts talking about how it's all about men oppressing women, and then Jordan Peterson says and minorities. She's revealing something here. I think you might have noticed because you emphasized it. Minority issues are useful, but not really what she cares about. Marxist analysis is useful, but not the point. When you successfully challenged her central threat narrative by asserting women's dominance over the marketplace, she shifted to a subordinate threat narrative, which is trans rights. The point isn't actually to advocate for trans issues, it's to use trans issues to dominate your identity by showing you as harmful to a recognized vulnerable group. All of these identitarian politics has one goal, and it's not cultural Marxism. It's actually a symptom. That's actually a symptom of a desire for complete smothering dominance. The goal is to control young men's identities. Young men are still our most productive class. Young men are still the reason why we have the prosperity and comfort we do. They're the reason why the petrodollar has any value. They're what's left of America's riches. I can hear you saying, but they're not giving young men a single word of encouragement. Like you said here, momentary dominance, long-term despair. The people pushing this threat narrative have hung everything on this one young man. And if he lets go, they're fucked. And that's all they're seeing right now. They're not seeing anything else, not the future, just what will happen if that young man stops listening to them. So they get more and more controlling with less and less return. They both need and hate that young man. They want to get rid of him, but they can't because he's so responsive to their lies. And it's so short-sighted. They're now telling young men that if they succeed, it's because the society took the success away from the people young men most want to serve, women. If young men succeed, it's because a society that hates women gave it to them, not because they earned it. That goes beyond not giving any encouragement to active discouragement of the ugliest sort. And it's because they don't want to acknowledge a single good thing about men. The very thought that there might be something good about young men makes bile rise to their back teeth. It's always been about dominating young men's identities. And you've just shown a whole bunch of young men how to slip their leash. Do you understand why Channel 4 had to reestablish their threat narrative dominance? All that nonsense about 50,000 tweets or comments are all supposedly nasty harassment directed towards the delicate flower Cathy Newman. Do you remember her sneering with delight at the thought of all that supposed hostility? Do you want to know why she's grinning like a dog chewing cat shit? Because that's how she got her threat narrative dominance back. Channel 4 couldn't keep you from demonstrating how to slip the leash, but they could double down on their threat narrative and double down on your followers. This is the one thing I can genuinely criticize you about. Instead of continuing to successfully resist Cathy Newman's and Channel 4's threat narrative, you bought into it when it came to your followers. You allowed them to smear your followers as harmful to women, harmful to Cathy Newman. That's why they were able to reassert their threat narrative, first against your followers and then against you, in the aftermath of your interview. But to be honest, I can tell you regret that, so I'm not going to belabor the point. At the end of the day, you won. You won, Professor Peterson. You won handily and helpfully. You showed the young men who follow you how to successfully fight back against a woman like Cathy Newman and her attempt to dominate your identity by painting you as harmful to women. You demonstrated to them how to pick up and wield the shield of men's issues and the sword of your own vulnerability, to not just defeat Cathy Newman, but to compel her to see you as a human being. You have demonstrated how to fight back. And this fight is bigger than just young men and the fact many of them never hear an encouraging word in their entire life. Our institutions of truth have terminal threat narrative cancer. You brushed up against the truth of this. Our institutions of so-called truth are using language to dominate. They're using language itself to dominate, not to express ideas, not to exchange observations and insight, not even to express vulnerability, just as a tool of threat narrative dominance. The cancer of using language as a tool of dominance has already gutted our institutions of reasons. It's turned colleges into factories for dogma. It's infected our institutions of law. Due process is the essence of rule of law, and we're deconstructing it. Threat narratives have infected everything, and we rely upon to maintain our complex society. This is unsustainable. Language, by its very essence, is a tool of mutual benefit and trust. If you change it into a tool of dominance, you will destroy it. Think about that. This is beyond them taking over our government and economy to turn us into Marxists. This can't be a conspiracy by Marxist forces, because its end goal is the death of language itself. What possible interest could want the death of language and by extension the destruction of all human civilization? Do cultural Marxists really want to go back to pre-verbal Stone Age society? Because if they do, we're all victims of their stupidity rather than their cunning. No, this has all the hallmarks of a train jumped its tracks and hurtling towards a cliff with no one at the controls. It's not coming out of any kind of political dogma. The problem is in the dynamic between men and women. That's why this cancer is everywhere and getting worse. And to wrestle an out-of-control threat narrative back under control, the battlefield will not be academia, it will not be media, it will not be government. It will be one young mind at a time. One young woman inoculated against becoming a cipher for a threat narrative like Cathy Newman, having her humanity crushed so she can learn to bark out her victimhood on command, inoculated by having her adult agency and responsibility, building blocks of her individuality recognized, just like you did with Cathy Newman when you said, "What right do you have?" One young man at a time, inoculated against having his identity dominated by a threat narrative, giving him the sword and the shield, men's issues, and owning his own vulnerability, to go toe-to-toe with the Cathy Newmans of the world, just like you did. And even more, that young man realizing that after challenging the threat narrative, that he is still cleaning his room, still lifting the heaviest weight, still being productive, that threat narrative, that the Cathy Newmans of the world were never responsible for all the good things he is. In my follow-up to Professor Peterson, cultural Marxism is not the problem, I used another example of man using his vulnerabilities to save. Jesus. To embrace public suffering and vulnerability to say, "I suffer," to purify the world of sin. And let's add Mary. To know how you will suffer and still agree to take up a great responsibility. Maybe this moment is what that story was for. Okay, that's it.
Well then.
That was nice.
That was great.
Yeah?
That was good. Yeah.
That was one of my
I
favorites.
gotta make this room less serious.
Oh, fuck off with that.
Okay.
Amen.
So does anybody have anything they want to criticize? Or the second one you appreciated more, Prim Reaper? The first one sets out a lot of terminology, I think.
Yeah, the first one
Yeah,
is a
the
setup
first
for...
one lays
It's a
the
setup to say, like, I'm not really saying anything about Peterson, I'm saying how he won.
Yeah. That's what I set it up in the first one, right?
Yeah.
Oh, well, maybe I
So
should be more clear that I'm not saying, I'm just explaining, like, I mean, there's some things that I think that he could have done a lot better, but...
You did an analysis of the battle, basically.
Yeah, an analysis of the battle.
Too bad Gopnik wasn't here to
I came
talk
in
about
and
it in his.
He's
oh,
here.
wow, you're here.
He's here.
Thank God.
Oh, Halkin says not enough bobs, but otherwise it was great. Well, you can never have enough bobs.
Never.
Yeah. Well,
What was I
there
supposed
wasn't
to do?
any ass.
What was Gopnik
Sorry?
supposed to do by being here?
With his awesome voice, talk about as if it was a war.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty good at war stories.
Yeah. Well, you have the pilot voice.
Yeah.
It's truly amazing.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Luga. Is it Luga?
Luga.
Luga.
Like a loogie.
Lugi.
Like a loogie.
All right, yeah. I mispronounce everybody's name. I cannot believe that I called Jax Jocks.
Well, you have yet to mispronounce my name.
Mine as well.
Derpy King? Dice? Oh, I just did.
It
Derpy
was
King.
Dorpkin, right?
I'm a
Dorpkin.
king now. Woo!
I just...
Dorpkin.
No, you always call me Derpy. That's fine. That's acceptable.
Okay, so...
Mine is a short one, so...
Okay, so Nestor says it was pretty good. Very good.
Yeah, and I think the fact, like, I think showing images really helps people recall the interview. You know,
Okay.
because for the most part, people are stuck on the strawman she committed, basically, but they don't see after that.
Yeah. What, you mean after the straw man? Oh, you mean all the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, because most people, I think, in this particular audience are more interested in the actual exchange of rational and
Yeah.
logical stuff. And like in the beginning, she was full of shit. I mean, and to us, like it's really obvious to anybody who's like trust what Jordan Peterson has to say already, or is thinking about everything logically. That's just she's just awful. She's just
Yeah, like you can see it in the original interview that like has close to 5 million views.
So you're saying
Yeah, like it was the definition of a strawman fallacy, and people could very easily see that
was
after
trying
like
to-
the third time.
You don't even have to look at her words. It's her facial expressions. Her body language is
I
atrocious.
didn't get to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All of these feminists have atrocious body language. That's one of the reasons why I can't stand them.
well, they all have this interest. Like I'm going to do this in the video, but you won't see this until if I upload the video. But they all have this sort of pursing in their lips,
Yeah.
and it's
like,
interesting
with-
because if you look at
It's disgust. It's a look of disgust because they're disgusted by everything that is not holy and true and one with them.
yeah, but if you
God forbid.
that slight lift of the lip is a sign of disgust, a universal sign of disgust. Like you can, and it can be even a micro expression.
have you seen okay Emma Watson? Now
Oh God, that bitch.
yeah, but if you look at her, and I don't mean this as like criticizing, like I look weathered too now because somebody said that I look like I'm since the trial started I've aged like a president, but it doesn't. It's okay. But
Our fearless leader.
the when you look at her, you can see these wrinkles, and it's actually interesting the placement of them because they're the exact place that you get when you purse your lips a lot. When you have that sort of
you can see it
contemptuous pursing of your lips, and she doesn't have smile lines. She doesn't have like the smile lines would be the depth,
Close, lower.
The crow's
the
feet.
jaw.
the crow's
crow's
the
feet,
not
yeah.
the specifically the crow's feet underneath your eye, like that spiders out from underneath to the side. That's more of a laugh line, or the smile lines, which are closer to your nose. No, she has lines right next to her, the outside of her lips, like the corners of her lips.
Yep, and those are usually the like when you meet older women that have that, it's usually like the bitchiest women, and they tend to have the largest rings. Just saying.
Yeah, so you can
They
see
also tend to be smokers. Those are also kind of like.
you can see the bitchiness is already carving itself into her face. And what she's like, what 14 or something? How old is she?
26.
26.
26, 27, something like that.
Yeah, it's just
It's not far from my age because I remember when she cast as Hermione and I was like, oh.
it's not and it's not even
I
like
expected her to be older.
it's not even a looks thing. It's the fact that her personality is starting to etch itself into her face.
Yeah, you can see it in
It's a
her,
shame.
even in
She
her
was
poker,
pretty, but now
poker
she's
face.
gonna be.
She was never pretty.
To me, she was.
Yeah,
No,
oh,
she
that's,
wasn't.
well, everybody has their own
She wasn't.
taste, right? Everybody has their own taste, and it is sad
Like, she
because
was pretty.
She looked like spoiled. I don't like spoiled. Sorry.
yeah,
Alright,
Perfect
I'm
as
still
Hermione, a
remembering
spoiled
her
brat.
in the movies, okay?
Yeah.
Now
yeah.
she looked spoiled.
Yeah.
She's always been spoiled.
But I just wanted to point that out because that's what I see a lot of feminists. They have that tightness of the lips,
The
like
fish
they're
face.
the fish face.
I
No,
put
I'm
a
gonna-
lovely illustration in the text chat that seems to encapsulate this very well.
Ah, okay. I'm not actually in text chat.
I
I'm
can't
in.
see it.
I'm in lobster grunts, lobstar, because we're all lobstars here.
That's literally
Hey now,
objectively ugly as a man.
Lobstar.
You're a lobstar.
has,
Okay, go play. Who sang that?
Hey now, you're a lobster. Get your crown, get paid.
Get paid
Yeah,
equally.
sorta.
Ah, yes, I see what's going on.
Okay,
Yeah, that's about right.
I'm gonna take off here because I'm gonna rest up and then I'm gonna do the honest to God recording tomorrow.
Okey-dokey.
I might have to.
Interesting.
Interesting?
Yes. I like that you kind of gave us like a draft.
Yeah.
And then you're going to move to the finished product. And I think this would be good for you because it gives you the feedback. And because you love feedback,
Mm-hmm.
which is good.
Oh, we got a lot of feedback from the Jordan Peterson fans.
I think feedback from your own audience is a little bit better, but also feedback from them is good too.
Yeah.
Even as crazed as it is.
Yeah, I don't know what I can do about the fact that I read off a script. That was a lot of their point, and the fact that I'm a leftist Marxist. I
Nobody
get.
points out your flaws better than somebody who dislikes you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think being a leftist is one of my flaws.
No,
Okay,
probably not. You being a dirty statist, maybe.
statist. Okay.
Sadist.
Accessory
Re.
stuff.
Ree! Remy, you have to read for me.
He just did.
Or
Re. Well, that was inert.
Re.
Okay,
Oh
that's
my
it.
God.
Oh,
I'm at work.
Bye.
bye.
Good night.
They don't say
Bye.